Fend Burnett, a civilian contractor at Fort Smith, wrote after the fact that Crow scouts visited the hay-cutting camp on July 31st with the news of the approaching horde of Cheyenne and Arapaho. The Crow were staunch enemies of the Sioux. Orphaned and destitute in the land of their fathers, the Crow volunteered as scouts and warriors for the U.S. Army in order to deprive the Sioux, if not regain for themselves, their traditional hunting grounds in the Powder River country. As Burnett puts it, quote, "With the whites, the Crows were always friendly, but with the Sioux, they were generally bitter enemies," unquote. All this being said, the hay-cutting crew, confident in their arms and defenses, laughed at the Crows' predictions and warnings to return to the fort, and remained camped in the hayfield. The next day, August 1st, 1867, broke clear and warm beneath an azure Montana sky. A morning mist listed from the creek in the valley, as the men in the hayfield corral prepared breakfast. After the meal, following the normal morning routine, 10 civilians drove the loaded hay wagons under mounted escort to Fort Smith several miles away. 20 soldiers stayed at camp under Lieutenant Sternberg, while 9 remaining civilians tended the animals, then maneuvered the mule-drawn mowing machines out into the field. About 9:30 in the morning, a lone shot rang through the valley, breaking the morning calm. Then a fusillade of shots, followed by the Cheyenne war cry, warned the soldiers and civilians that the Crow reports were correct. The pickets were already raising the alarm when 9 mule-drawn machines, their lunging animals and beating drivers, racing towards the enclosure in front of the horde of mounted warriors. Lieutenant Sigismund Sternberg of the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry, his 20 soldiers, and the 9 civilians quickly took refuge inside the corral. The Indians came so rapidly that they occupied the rifle pits outside the corral before the soldiers could control them. The soldiers and civilians took cover behind the logs. After the first volley from the soldiers, the Indians rushed the corral, anticipating that the soldiers would take 20 or 30 seconds to reload their rifled muskets. They were surprised when the soldiers quickly shot off a second volley, as produced by their new, faster breech-loading rifles. The Indians broke off the attack, which gave the defenders time to improve their defenses by hurriedly digging trenches and filling the hay receptacles with dirt to stop the bullets. Early in the engagement, 2nd Lieutenant Sigismund Sternberg, commanding officer of the hay-cutting detachment, stood up within the corral. He attempted to order his men to also stand and, quote, "fight like men," unquote. Shortly after those words left his mouth, he was shot dead, along with Private Thomas Navin. Sergeant James Horton took command, but was severely wounded shortly after as well. A civilian, D. Al Colvin, a veteran captain of the War Between the States, then directed the defenses, his Henry repeater downing multiple warriors. Colvin spaced the men at intervals around the inside of the corral, with each assuming a specific field of fire. Their predicament seemed grim, as the minutes turned to an hour with no aid from the garrison at the fort. Colvin allegedly remarked, quote, "We will never get out of here alive," unquote, but still directed his men as coolly as facing the Rebs at Gettysburg. The Indians charged the corral again from the bluffs to the east and south. They were again repulsed, but killed another soldier and wounded 2 more. The Indians set fire to the grass and the lattice work wall around the fort with flaming arrows. They used the smoke screen to creep within a dozen yards of the corral, but mostly used it as an opportunity to remove all of their dead and wounded. The fire subsided when the wind changed direction. Sniping between the two sides continued all morning. No reinforcements came from Fort Smith, although the sounds of battle should have been audible to the soldiers in the fort. On an overlooking hill, Lieutenant Palmer was escorting a woodcutting party out of the mountains and witnessed the ferocious fighting. Keeping a tight formation around the trains of wagons, the lieutenant made a hasty return to the fort and arrived while fending off a few Cheyenne at around 1 p.m. in the afternoon. He asked his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Luther P. Bradley, for permission to lead reinforcements to the hayfield. At Lieutenant Palmer's request to lead a relief force, Colonel Bradley refused, possibly fearing another Fetterman-like ambush laying in wait for his men, though he never states as such in his official report. As for Burnett, Colville, and the other men in the hayfield, they would later brand Bradley a coward for this inaction. The Indians withdrew about noon, and the soldiers refilled their water barrel in Warrior Creek, some 30 feet outside the corral. It was the heat of the day, and while exhausted, the defenders downed a handful of hardtack, deepened their trenches, and adjusted the sights on their trapdoor rifles, or needle rifles, as Burnett calls them. With scant hope of relief, each resolved to save one bullet for himself should the Indians succeed in taking the corral. The Indians resumed the attack that afternoon, but the soldiers were firmly entrenched. The Indians had little ammunition, and the arrows had little effect on the soldiers behind the log barriers. The Indians shot at pack animals, killing or severely wounding 19 of the 22 mules in the corral. Burnett recounts, quote, "The loss on our side was Lieutenant Sternberg, a citizen named Hollister, and a sergeant whose name I have forgotten, killed. In addition, we had 4 men wounded, all soldiers but one. One of those wounded men was a sergeant. He was shot through the shoulder and most painfully injured. He and 2 of the other wounded men never failed to assist us in every charge made by the Indians. We had placed them in a tent where they would be out of the intense heat of the day, but whenever the Indians pressed us too closely, the men would stagger out and stand with us until we had driven the Indians back to cover. The sergeant was such that he could not use a rifle, but we kept 2 revolvers loaded for his use, and right well did he use them in every attack." Private Charles Bradley volunteered to ride, to make a break from the corral for the fort and take word of their desperate situation. Although he was pursued by several warriors at so close an interval that they could count a coup on him, he managed to reach the fort safely. Finally, at 4 p.m., 7 hours after the first shots of the battle, Colonel Bradley ordered Lieutenant Shirley out with 20 mounted soldiers and civilians. The company advanced cautiously and soon drew fire as they neared within a mile of the hayfield. Company G under Captain Burrows sallied from the fort with reinforcements and to order the men to withdraw. During the retreat, they were met halfway by Lieutenant Fenton with a mountain howitzer. Halting the retreat, they pushed forward to the hayfield. The soldiers reached the corral about sundown, by which time most of the Indians had already given up the fight and departed. With a final salvo from the mountain howitzer, the men sallied from the corral. By 8:30 that night, all the soldiers had returned to Fort Smith. 2 days after the Hayfield fight, Colonel Greene arrived at the fort with 2 companies of cavalry. The fight was, of course, the sole topic, and it was regarded as a miracle that the loss was so slight in comparison with the immense number of Indians that opposed them. The Crow Indians traveled back and forth between Fort Smith and the Sioux village on the Little Bighorn. They reported to Colonels Greene and Bradley that the Sioux loss was terrible, hundreds of warriors slain. The Crow witnessed the Cheyenne carrying their dead into the hills, caching them atop burial poles. Burnett records in his retelling of the aftermath. Colonel Greene asked these Crows if they could guide him to a place in order to get a more correct estimate of the Indian loss. They agreed to do this, and the colonel, accompanied by 2 of his troops of cavalry and several citizens, including Captain Colvin, A.C. Lawton, the sutler at Fort Smith, myself, and others, all went to the first ledge, which was about 2 miles south of the hayfield. We found over 50 bodies. The Crows requested that the colonel and his detachment accompany them to the next ledge, which was about 2 miles east of the first burial site. They said there were even more bodies there than on the first ledge. However, Colonel Greene refused to go further, knowing that the Sioux had yet plenty of fighting warriors left, and not caring to bring on another engagement with them. We therefore returned to the fort, satisfied that the Crows were telling the truth.